Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeo Viking. Today is the official eighth video and unofficial fifth video in my series on early U.S. Imperial expansion. The subject of today's video is the period in the United States history when the U.S. really began to see the rise of what would become American nationalism. It was a period of great exultation and what has often been called good feelings. In this era in question, this time period in question, is what is known as the era of good feelings. However, before we get into the era of good feelings itself, we need to go a little bit further back in time to get a good background for why the era of good feelings was able to happen. So the background for the era of good feelings really starts when America went to war with the British Empire in the War of 1812. Uh, and it was during this war that the British Empire would win most of the strategic victories in the war, such as seizing the state of Maine, as well as the near total blockade of the American coast, as well as the burning of Washington, D.C. and the White House, and the capture of Camden County in South Georgia, in what is now modern day St. Mary's, Georgia. However, despite the continued British tactical victories and strategic victories during the War of 1812, the U.S. would be able to pull off several symbolic victories, albeit minor victories, but symbolic victories nonetheless, such as the Battle of Baltimore and the Battle of New Orleans. With all of these victories really boosting the morale for the U.S. military as well as the United States as a whole. At the same time these battles were happening, the New England leaders of one of the two political parties at the time, the Federalist Party, would meet to discuss their grievances concerning the ongoing War of 1812 and the political problems arising from the federal government's increase of power. They would meet, this group of Federalists would meet between December 15th of 1814 all the way through January 5th of 1815 CE. The Federalists had issues including the Louisiana Purchase as well as the embargo of 1807. Despite opposition from key convention leader Harrison Gray Otis, secession would actually be mentioned really for the first time throughout the convention, with all but one leading Federalist newspaper in New England supporting the plan to expel the Western states from the Union. At the time, the Western states would be like Wisconsin and Ohio and things like that. And the Massachusetts Governor Strong would actually send secret missions to discuss terms with the British for a separate peace. The call for secession was because all New England states, especially Connecticut, with its claims to Western lands, stood to lose more than they would gain. However, the final report of the convention did not propose secession. And with the Hartford Convention's final report proposing several amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which were attempts to combat the policies of the ruling Democratic Republican Party, not to be mistaken for either the modern Democrat or modern Republican Party. This was its own specific party. With these amendments including a prohibition to any trade embargo lasting over 60 years, these amendments included a requirement of two-thirds congressional majority for a declaration of an offensive war, an admission of a new state, or an interdiction of foreign commerce. They also stated that they wanted to remove the three-fifths representation advantage of the South. They also proposed to limit future presidents to a single term. There was a requirement or a proposed requirement for each president to be from a different state than his predecessor. After this convention and the creation of these proposed amendments, Massachusetts would send 3 commissioners to Washington, D.C. to negotiate the terms that had been agreed upon. However, by the time they arrived in February 1815 CE, news of Andrew Jackson's overwhelming victory at the Battle of New Orleans, as well as the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, preceded the delegates from the Hartford Convention getting to Washington. And consequently, their presence in the capital seemed both ludicrous and subversive. Thereafter, both the Hartford Convention and the Federalist Party became synonymous with disunion, secession, and treason, especially in the South. The party would then be ruined and would cease to be a significant force in national politics, although in a few places, such as Massachusetts, the Federalist Party would retain some power until 1823 CE. And here is a sort of political cartoon about the Hartford Convention. And as I said in the next to last slide, eventually the War of 1812 would come to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, the treaty being officially signed on December 14th, 1814 CE, but the war would not fully come to a stop until February 17th of 1815 CE. Which brings us now to our next section, the era of good feelings, the bulk of our video overall. So, after the War of 1812 ended, despite, again, going back to what we were talking about with the symbolic victories, despite Britain winning the majority of strategic victories in the War of 1812, the symbolic victories won by the U.S., such as the Battle of New Orleans, resulted in an exultation replacing the bitter political divisions between the Federalists and Republicans. Also, I want to point out that I spelled divisions as divisions on accident. But it would end this exaltation would replace the bitter political divisions between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, oftentimes called Republicans for short, but again, not the same thing as the modern Republican Party. It would also end the bitter political division between the North and the South, as well as would end, to at least some degree, the bitter political division between the East Coast cities and settlers on the American frontier. This would reflect a sense of national purpose and desire for unity among Americans in the aftermath of the War of 1812. Furthermore, as a party, due to the largely and predominantly due to the Hartford Convention, the Federalist Party would collapse as a national political force, with leaving the Democratic Republican Party as the nominally dominant political party. Though it is important to note that in practice, the Democratic Republican Party was inactive at the national level as well as inactive in most states. This exultation and desire for unity would lead President James Madison and the majority of the Democratic Republican Party to come to appreciate, through, quote, the crucible of war, the expediency of Federalist institutions and projects, and would lead them to be prepared to legislate these projects under John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay's American system. So what is the American system? Well, the American system is an economic plan that sought to establish a protective tariff of around 20 to 25% tax on imported goods, which was supposed to protect a nation's businesses from foreign competition. They also sought to establish a national bank that would promote a single currency that would therefore make trade easier and would issue what is known as sovereign credit, i.e., credit issued by the national government rather than borrowed from private banking systems. They also sought to improve the country's infrastructure, especially transportation systems, to make trade easier and faster for everyone. Poor roads, for example, make transportation slow and costly. So they would begin to improve the roads uh, and would begin to construct new roads with many of these internal improvements, including road systems such as the Cumberland Road. And this would eventually lead the American system to become a leading tenet of the Whig Party of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and would eventually be opposed by the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and James K. Polk. Again, not to be mistaken for the Democratic Republican Party, still a different political party. Under the American system, the construction and improvements of roads, such as the Cumberland Road, seen on the left, and the construction of canals, such as the Erie Canal, seen on the right, would begin and would eventually improve transportation and communication, which in itself would begin the Industrial Revolution in the United States. At the same time, seeking to cut back on spending, spending costs from the War of 1812, the U.S. Army would be cut by 2/3, resulting in the Army being decreased from 62,000 soldiers to only 10,000 soldiers in 1815 CE. And again, following the American system, the Tariff of 1816 would be passed on April 27th, 1816 CE. And the U.S. government would also create the Second Bank of the United States under this American system as well in February 1816 CE. So what was the American system? Well, the American system was an economic plan whose main points were things like establishing a protective tariff of around 20 to 25% on imported goods, under the idea that this would protect the nation's business from foreign competition. It proposed the establishment of a national bank to promote a single currency in the hopes that trade would be made easier, and these national banks would issue what are known as sovereign credit, or credit issued by the national government rather than borrowed from a private banking system. The American system also proposed the improvement of the U.S.'s infrastructure, especially the transportation systems, in the hopes of making trade easier and faster for everyone. Because after all, poor roads make transportation slow and costly. Among the most important of the internal improvements created under the American system, it was the Cumberland Road. And this system would become the leading tenet of the Democratic Republican Party and eventually the Whig Party of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and would also eventually be opposed by the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and James K. Polk, who often stated that the points of it were unconstitutional. Again, I want to point out that for the final time that the Democratic Party is not the same thing as the Democratic Republican Party. So many of these improvements made by the American system, such as the construction improvements of roads such as the Cumberland Road, as well as the construction of canals such as the Erie Canal, would begin during the era of good feelings and would eventually lead to the improvement of transportation and communication, which in itself would begin the Industrial Revolution in the United States itself. At the same time the American system was being developed and these improvements were being implemented, the U.S. government would proceed to cut costs wherever they could, especially costs from the military, as the military was a very expensive cost from the War of 1812. So the U.S. Government would cut the U.S. Army down by 2/3, reducing the U.S. Army from 62,000 soldiers to only 10,000 soldiers in 1815 CE. Then, under the American system, the Second Bank of the United States would be created in February of 1816 CE, and the Tariff of 1816 would be passed in April 27th of 1816 CE. Also, James Madison would go on to veto the Bonus Bill of 1817, which was a legislation proposed by John C. Calhoun to earmark the revenue bonus and future dividends from the recently established Second Bank of the United States for an internal improvements fund. Proponents of the bill stressed that the nearly universal accepted need for improvements and will brush off strict constructionists with their own arguments in favor of implied powers. While James Madison would approve of the need and stated goals of improvements, he vetoed the bill as unconstitutional because he found no express congressional power to fund roads and canals in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, with his veto message representing an important explication of, quote, the father of the Constitution. However, of course, James Madison could not remain president forever, and eventually, in the presidential election of 1816 CE, his successor and fellow founding father, James Monroe, would win the presidential election in a landslide victory, which you can see here in this election map from 1816 CE. After his presidential victory, Monroe would begin a campaign to eliminate all party associations completely from national politics, including his own Democratic Republican Party, as he believed that all political parties were incompatible, or one could argue still are incompatible with free government by their very nature. During this period of time known as the Era of Good Feelings, it wasn't just a time period of economic reform and political reform. It was also a time period of large amounts of acquisitions and conquests of new territory and lands, and one would say annexations of new territories and lands into the United States. And these really started with negotiations between the United States and the Cherokee that would eventually result in what is known as the Jackson-McMinn Treaty, which would transfer lands fronted by the Saskatchewan River in Tennessee to the United States in return for secured title to lands along the Arkansas and White Rivers for the Cherokee. In the treaty, the federal government would promise to fund the move of the Cherokee to the west. However, what I'm sure is unsurprising to anyone watching this video, when the Cherokee arrived in Arkansas Territory, they very quickly discovered that the land promised to them was already in possession of other Native American nations. And this treaty would be signed in 1817 CE. Then, at the same time and after this treaty was signed, Jackson, one of the individuals who facilitated the Jackson-McMinn Treaty, General Andrew Jackson, would march into Florida with the U.S. Army and would defeat the Seminole Nation in the First Seminole War, which lasted from 1817 to 1818 CE. At the same time, Jackson would, at the end of the Seminole War, would go to facilitate more treaties with Native American nations, such as the treaties of Tuscaloosa and the so-called Jackson Purchase, which would result in Chickasaw land cessions in Tennessee and Kentucky to the United States in October 1818 CE. And here's a little plaque explaining what the Jackson Purchase was. Further west, a treaty that had nothing to do with Jackson was being signed, which was simply called the Treaty of 1818. It was signed between the U.S. and the British Empire in order to resolve standing boundary issues between the two nations, with the treaty allowing for joint occupation of and settlement of the Oregon country. And the treaty was signed in October 20th of 1818 CE. Then, just a year after, Spain would cede Florida to the U.S. and would agree on a defined boundary between the United States and New Spain, eventually Mexico, in the Adam Onis Treaty of February 22nd, 1819 CE. And there is the boundary uh, agreed upon in that treaty here. Now on to Monroe's political aims. So Monroe would go on a two countrywide goodwill tours, where he would don a Revolutionary War officer's uniform and tie his long hair, and powder his hair in an old-fashioned style from the 18th century, and he would do this in order to essentially elicit nationalist pride, which he succeeded in doing. There was a huge outpouring of this nationalist pride. He also hoped to create and elicit expressions of reconciliation, and he would do these in 1817 and 1819 CE. However, all was not necessarily well in the United States during the era of good feelings. Yes, there was economic reform that was being proposed. Yes, there was an effort to repair and improve infrastructure and trade. Yes, new territories had been annexed and or conquered from Native American nations, uh, bringing Native American land into the United States and therefore making the United States larger. However, and there was also efforts by American politicians such as James Monroe to create and increase national unity and happiness. But there was also um, economic strife going on during this period of time, specifically the Panic of 1819 CE, which was an economic downturn driven by global market adjustments in the aftermath of the destruction of the Napoleonic Wars, as well as excessive speculation in public lands, and was fueled by unrestrained issue of paper money from banks and business concerns. The Second Bank of the United States, who was deeply enmeshed in inflationary practices, would seek to compensate for its laxness in regulating the state bank credit market by initiating a sharp curtailment in loans by its western branches, beginning in 1818 CE. Failing to provide gold specie from the reserves when presented with their own banknotes for redemption by the Second Bank of the United States, the state chartered banks began foreclosing on the heavily mortgaged farms and business properties that they had financed. The ensuing financial panic would happen in conjunction with a sudden recovery in European agricultural production in 1817 CE, which would lead to widespread bankruptcies and mass unemployment. The financial disaster and recession would provoke popular resentment against banking and business enterprise, along with a general belief that federal government economic policy is fundamentally flawed. Americans, many for the first time, become politically engaged to defend their local economic interests. The Democratic Republican Party and their American system are exposed to sharp criticism, eliciting a vigorous defense. The panic would then bring attention to issues regarding debt relief policy as well as poor relief, with city and state governments being able to move to more effectively approach the public policy reform issues surrounding the poor, uh, which in itself would lead to a classification system being created, which would be able-bodied versus disabled, temporary versus long-term, etc. Public attention to solving poverty issues would consequently lead to the creation of public education systems. Also, the Panic of 1819 CE would be credited with, at least in part, with spurring American citizens to immigrate to the Mexican state of Coahuila y Tejas, which would eventually become the Republic of Texas, and of course later the state of Texas within the United States. During this time, during this panic, McCulloch v. Maryland would determine that Congress does indeed have the power to create the bank, reanimating the disputes over the supremacy of state sovereignty and federal power between strict construction of the United States Constitution and loose construction. And this would happen in March 1819 CE. However, despite these issues, James Monroe would run unopposed completely in the presidential election of 1820 CE and would win his second term. After this, the U.S. government would send Colonel Henry Atkinson and Major Stephen Harriman Long on what would become known as the Yellowstone Expedition, with the goal of establishing a military fort or outpost at the mouth of the Yellowstone River in present-day North Dakota, with this expedition lasting from 1819 to 1820 CE. The Yellowstone expedition would peacefully meet with several Native American nations, such as the Pawnee, seen here and here, and this expedition would also establish Fort Atkinson in what is now present-day Nebraska. And here's Fort Atkinson here. Though the Yellowstone expedition would fail due to its financial costs and general lack of first season results, Major Long would be ordered to continue exploring the Platte River and its sources on May of 1820 CE. And here is the map that he made from those expeditions. Perhaps one of the most controversial events to happen during the era of good feelings is an event known as the Missouri Compromise, which was which happened after an intense debate between northern states who wanted to prevent expansion of slavery in the country, and between those in the southern states who wanted to, of course, expand slavery. This would eventually result in the admission of Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, with the U.S. government declaring a policy of prohibiting slavery in the remaining Louisiana Purchase lands north of the 36th parallel. And this compromise would be signed on March 6th of 1820 CE. Now, unsurprisingly, during this time, the United States would continue to annex new lands into its territory, with Andrew Jackson approaching the Choctaw Nation, where he would first use bribery or attempt to use bribery to get the Choctaw Nation to give the United States some of their land. But when that failed, Andrew Jackson would use threats of military invasion by the United States to coerce and force the Choctaw Nation to cede some land to the United States in what a treaty known as the Treaty of Doak Stand, with the lands ceded being shaded in orange and green. And this treaty was signed in October 18th of 1820 CE. Similarly, just a year after, negotiations between the Muskogee, also known as the Creek Nation, and the state of Georgia would result in Muskogee land cessions to the United States and what is known as the First Treaty of Indian Springs. However, another result of this treaty was the Muskogee National Council swearing not to cede any additional land to the United States, with the Muskogee Nation decreeing a sentence of death for violation of that pledge. And they would sign this treaty in January 8th of 1821 CE and would cede the lands you see here in red and see here in this little section of the map here. However, despite the continued annexation of new lands, the U.S. government was still reeling from the Panic of 1819, and so they were continuing to look for ways to cut costs and combat the damage done by the Panic of 1819, with one of these measures being the drastic slashing of the military budget and the further reduction in size of the U.S. Army from the 10,000 that it had already been reduced to roughly 6,000 soldiers in 1821 CE. And this would actually greatly impact the U.S. military's combat effectiveness, especially when conflicts such as the Arauca War broke out between the United States and the Arauca Nation in the Great Plains, which would result in an indecisive conflict between the two nations between June 2nd and August 11th of 1823 CE. Now, I will note, I will talk about this conflict in greater detail in the next video. Just shortly after the Arauca War, the United States would annex even more Native American land into its nation with the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which was signed between the United States and the chiefs of several groups within the Seminole Nation, with the treaty establishing a reservation in the center of the Florida Peninsula, and the treaty, of course, ceding all coastal lands to the United States government, as the U.S. wanted control of overseas trade between Florida and the Caribbean. With this treaty being signed in September 18th of 1823 CE. While all this was happening, President James Monroe was continuing to push his political agenda and in his ideas for political reforms. And the longest lasting of these agendas and reforms is a document known as the Monroe Doctrine, which he signed into policy in December 2nd of 1823 CE. And this was a document that Monroe would first articulate in the 7th Annual State of the Union Address to Congress. It's important to note that at this time, nearly all Spanish colonies in the Americas had either achieved or were close to independence. So because of this, Monroe would assert that to Europe that the New World and the Old World were to remain distinctly separate spheres of influence, and thus further efforts by European powers to control or influence sovereign states in the region would be viewed as a threat to U.S. security. In turn, Monroe stated that the United States would recognize and not interfere with existing European colonies, nor meddle in internal affairs of European countries. However, it's also important to note that because the U.S. lacked a credible navy and army at the time of the doctrine's proclamation, it was essentially ignored by European colonial powers, while it was granted successfully enforced, at least in part, by the United Kingdom, who would actually use it as an opportunity to enforce its own Pax Britannica policy. But the doctrine would still be broken several times over the course of the 19th century because, again, European nations were just sort of like, all right, whatever, and whatever you say, America, and then would go about their own business. However, because of Monroe's policies, Monroe would go on to have 4 main political rivals towards the end of his presidency. And these would be John Quincy Adams, John C. Calhoun, the individual who sort of looks like Doc Brown from the Back to the Future movies, William H. Crawford, and the most famous of them, Andrew Jackson. And eventually, all 4 of these political rivals would actually take a shot at winning the presidency in the election of 1824, which would actually result in the election being inconclusive because no candidate would be able to win the majority of the electoral vote. And you can see that in this political map from the 1824 election here. In order to solve this issue and actually find somebody, actually have a winner in the presidential election, the House of Representatives would hold a vote with each state delegation casting a single vote that would eventually result in the election of John Quincy Adams as president and would result in Henry Clay being made the Secretary of State. This event would go on to be known by Andrew Jackson and his supporters as the quote corrupt bargain. And this election would officially end the era of good feelings. However, it should be noted that the era of good feelings was not was still unofficially going on, especially with one final territorial annexation during the this era. Uh, and that territorial annexation was the acquisition of Muskogee Creek territory east of the Flint River, which had been ceded to the state of Georgia against the wishes of the Muskogee National Council by Muskogee Chief William McIntosh. And this would be ceded in a treaty known as the Second Treaty of Indian Springs, which would in turn eventually lead to the assassination of William McIntosh by several members of the Muskogee Council. And this would happen just 3 days after the quote corrupt bargain in February 12th of 1825 CE. Now that leads us to our last section, the aftermath of the era of good feelings. So for one thing, as a result of things such as the corrupt bargain and the politics of Monroe and Madison, political consensus would begin to decline, and it would become imperative to many U.S. politicians to revive Jeffersonian principles on the basis of Southern exceptionalism. And essentially, Jeffersonian beliefs and ideals included things like limited federal government, a focus on an agrarian economy, focus on personal freedoms and liberties, and a focus on the belief in the common laborer. And of course, the most obvious aftermath of the corrupt bargain and the policies of Monroe and Madison would be the revival. There will be the creation of an agrarian alliance between the North and the South, which would be revived and eventually lead to the formation of Jacksonian nationalism and would lead to the rise of the Democratic Party as a separate entity from the Democratic Republican Party. But that subject of Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian era is a subject to be discussed in a later video in this series. And with that, that leads to the end of our video on the era of good feelings. With that, I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you would like to see me cover anything I mentioned in this video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.